My name is David Lepofsky. I'm chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. I'm also a visiting professor of disability rights at the faculties of law at the University of Western Ontario and the University of Ottawa. Immediately beside me is Julia Evangelisto, who is a founding co-founder of the Ontario Parents for Educational Supports. They advocate for kids with disabilities in the education system. And beside Julia is Kate Chung, who is co-founder of the Accessible Housing Coalition. We are furious. We are determined, and we are ready. Some 20 years ago, there was a historic event in this legislature on the 10th of May, 2005. On that day, the Ontario legislature voted unanimously to pass the historic landmark Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Not only did they vote unanimously for it, they rose to give it a unanimous standing ovation. That legislation, the first Accessibility Act in Canada, that legislation required the Ontario government to lead this province to become accessible to 2.9 million people with disabilities by January 1st, 2025. Now, most laws that get passed here don't really come from the people, from the public. They come from political platforms. They come from public servants in policy branches across the Ontario government. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was very different. It came from us. It came from people with disabilities who fought a 10-year, exhausting campaign from one end of Ontario to the other, from 1994 to 2005, to get this law passed. We came up with the ideas of what this law should include, and we mounted the campaign to get it passed. I had the privilege of leading that decade-long campaign. Yes, the day that this law passed was a day for celebration. However, what has happened since? For years, we, the AODA Alliance, other disability advocates, and 4 successive independent reviews from the government itself, appointed by the government, handpicked by the government, warned the government that they needed to revitalize and strengthen their implementation of this law if it was going to achieve its purpose. We warned for over 15 years that we were behind schedule and that unless things changed, we were not going to meet the legislated guaranteed deadline. Well, what happened? There has been some progress. There is no doubt that we have gotten some barriers removed and some barriers prevented that impede people with disabilities when they try to get a job, buy goods and services, or enjoy public services. But now, 20 years later, on New Year's Day 2025, people with disabilities woke up to a province that is still replete with soul-crushing barriers, to progress that is glacial on accessibility. Those words, soul-crushing barriers and glacial progress, they're not my words. They're the words of the late and lamented David Onley, former lieutenant governor, who wrote the 3rd of the 4 independent reviews of the Disabilities Act's implementation. How do we know these barriers are there? Well, just ask people with disabilities. We did 2 months ago, on November 25th, 2004, to celebrate and mark the 30th anniversary of the birth of our grassroots nonpartisan movement. We came to Queen's Park and invited people with disabilities to tell us and members of the legislature what barriers they still face. Their stories were wrenching. This is all available on our YouTube channel, as it was captured on video for all time as a record of where we're at. These were at public hearings, not ones that the legislature called, ones that we organized and MPPs from all parties presided at. How else do we know? We know that we still have a province full of barriers because the independent reviews that the government itself appointed every 3 or 4 years, as the Disabilities Act required, they each documented these barriers. They heard from the community, they heard from people with disabilities, they made their own independent findings, and remember, the people conducting these independent reviews were experts that the government handpicked. And if that's not enough, just look at the media. Every couple of weeks, if not more frequently, there's a report somewhere about somebody with a disability facing a barrier in education or housing or public transit or access to health care or all other parts of life. Last month, the Metroland newspapers or the Metroland publications ran an incredible series called Restricted Access, with at least 27 articles included from around the province, looking at local communities and identifying the barriers that still persist. Yes, there are people who are trying to change it, but there's been a failure of government leadership time and again. We are nonpartisan. It's been a pattern across the 20 years. When this law first passed, it got a good start. And to the credit of the government back in 2003 under Dalton McGuinty, they get credit for passing this law. The opposition parties get credit for voting for it and indeed trying to strengthen it before it was passed. And the McGuinty government got a good start in the first couple of years, but slowly and unfortunately progressively, things slowed down from a slow pace to a snail's pace to, in David Onley's words, glacial progress. Well, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? We are at a pivotal moment in the history of the campaign for accessibility for people with disabilities. We worked with government after government, minister after minister for 20 years. We made suggestions, we made proposals, we offered advice. But what do we do now? Well, the first thing is this. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act did not vanish on New Year's Day. It's still the law. The Ontario government still has the duty to lead this province to become accessible to people with disabilities. And having missed the legislative deadline, the government has the obligation to get us to that goal as soon after that legislative deadline. The government has the obligation to lead Ontario to become an accessible province as soon after that legislative deadline as possible. We're here to give constructive proposals on how to do it. What was wrong? Well, there were several things that went wrong, but the most important thing I believe that went wrong was no government, established a comprehensive beginning to end multi-year plan with deadlines for all the steps the government needed to take to ensure that barriers against people with disabilities were removed and prevented across Ontario within the 20 years that the legislature gave. 20 years was more than enough time, but there was never a plan. And without a plan, you got a pretty good guarantee that you're going to fall short. So we have come forward with a plan, and today we unveil it. We have provided now to all the political parties in a letter that's included in our news release and available on www.aodaalliance.org, right at the top of our What's New page, our January 6th, 2025 letter to all the party leaders calls on the parties to make what we call the Accessible Ontario Pledge. It's a 10-point pledge that lists all the major steps that need to be taken by the government and proposes timelines for getting them going. This is not the first time we've engaged in this kind of exercise. Either the AODA Alliance or before 2005, our predecessor coalition that I led, the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, since 1995, in each one of the 8 general elections that have been held, we have written all the parties and asked for election commitments. We are nonpartisan. We don't support or oppose any party. We try to get all the parties to make strong commitments and to let the over 1 million voters with disabilities in this province and everybody else know where the parties stand. We've done it again. We have provided a clear, comprehensive, constructive package, a plan, the very plan that we've been missing for 20 years. We're providing it. We're calling on the party leaders to adopt it and to make the Accessible Ontario Pledge. Now, did we just pull this thing out of the air? No. It's based on 30 years of advocacy by our community, consulting with the disability community and with organizations that would have to comply with these requirements. We have held public forum after public forum over these 30 years. We have received literally thousands of emails and posts on social media. But as well, we have drawn on expertise that we've acquired by our participation in the 4 independent reviews that the government has appointed and which have reported. We took active part in those. We drew on their final reports, most of whose recommendations no government ever implemented. And we drew on our sense of being ambitious, but being realistic. We propose things that are required, but that are also completely doable. Before I go through the details of it in a quick and summary form, let me just say 2 things. First, it's pretty widely rumored that there could well be a spring election in Ontario. We are asking the parties to now commit that they will make the Accessible Ontario Pledge. Let me rephrase that. We are asking the political parties to commit to the Accessible Ontario Pledge now. If there is an election, we want this as an election promise. If there is no election, we don't want to wait till the next election. There's a government in power. They got elected to govern the province. Their duties as government include effectively implementing the Disabilities Act. We want the government to make the Accessible Ontario Pledge now and to get right to work implementing it. As for the opposition parties, if there's no election, or if there's an election and they don't win, we want them to commit to this pledge and to use their power in the legislature, their voice in the legislature and their bully pulpit in the community to advocate for the government to make and implement the Accessible Ontario Pledge. Let's focus not just on the abstract, but the very practical. My 2 fellow panelists are going to briefly speak about just 2 of the areas to which this pledge relates. The first is education for kids with disabilities, and for that I turn to the co-founder of a coalition of parents of children and youth with disabilities who advocate for the needs of these children in our school system. Julia Evangelisto, co-founder of the Ontario Parents for Education Support.
1/3 of a million students with disabilities face unfair disability barriers in Ontario K-12 schools. There are not enough teaching and support staff available who are trained to teach all learners. Many, if not most Ontario schools, lack physical accessibility needed so students with disabilities can get around. Too often, school boards ignore universal design, leaving children with disabilities unable to access school playgrounds, virtual learning spaces, field trips, and lessons. The special education system is bulging with bureaucratic barriers. It's a nightmare for parents to navigate. Families find it hard to even find out what options and services are available at school for their children. All kids are supposed to be guaranteed the right to an education. However, school boards can exclude students from school, including students with disabilities, for all or part of school days, even without giving a reason. The Ministry of Education doesn't collect statistics on this from school boards, so it's an unfair world of don't ask, don't tell. Kids with disabilities cannot get a good job if they cannot get a good education. 9 years ago, the Ontario government promised to enact an education accessibility standard under the AODA. We still don't have one. For 3 years, the current government has sat on a detailed expert report by a government-appointed advisory committee. 72 school boards in this province are left floundering. Too often, they let accessibility slide. Frustrated parents agonize as their children with disabilities fall behind. The Accessible Ontario Pledge tackles this festering problem.
Thanks. A second area, and we could include so many, but a second one that we'll highlight today is the need for accessible housing. And a tremendous advocate in this area is my colleague and friend Kate Chung, who is co-founder of the Accessible Housing Coalition. Kate?
Politicians pledge to solve the shortage of affordable housing, but we desperately need action on the accessible housing crisis. People with disabilities find it impossible to find an accessible place to live. The crisis is getting worse as our population ages. And ironically, the cost of building a new apartment is the same whether it's accessible or not. So what's the problem? The government has done absolutely nothing under the AODA to require more accessible housing, either houses or condos or rental apartments. Some people with disabilities are having to crawl around their apartment because they can't get their wheelchair in the door. Parents are struggling to carry teenagers up and down stairs because they can't find an accessible house. The government needs to use its power under the AODA to enact a residential housing accessibility standard. The Ontario Building Code must be revised to mandate that all housing be accessible. If they can do it in Australia, we can do it here. We need the Ontario government to actually make housing accessible. The time for talking is over. We need action.
Thanks, Kate. So what's in our 10-point Accessible Ontario Pledge? Let me summarize. First, we ask party leaders to commit to foster and strengthen their relationship with us in the disabilities community. They need to hear from us to know what needs to be done and how best to do it. Second, we ask the party leaders to each commit to show strong leadership on accessibility. We've had 4 independent reviews that have in increasingly strong language called on the government, all the way up to the Premier's office, to show strong, new, revitalized leadership on accessibility. They haven't. Third, we've asked the parties to commit that there will be no backsliding on accessibility, that none of the protections we've already secured, that none of them will be either diluted or eliminated. As part of this, we do not want the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act to be amended or even to be opened up in the legislature for possible amendment. We don't want to lose anything we've gained. Fourth, we need the government to enact all the enforceable accessibility standards that we need to get to the goal of an accessible Ontario. That's what the AODA explicitly requires the government to do. The government has passed some accessibility standards, but the ones they've passed are too weak, are too narrow, and do not cover the majority of barriers that people with disabilities face in our society. Next, we call on the government to substantially speed up and streamline the process for developing accessibility standards. There's no reason why there is no reason why Ontario has needed to take 9 years to develop an education accessibility standard, and we still don't have one. Or, making it worse, 10 years to develop a healthcare accessibility standard, to tear down the barriers impeding patients with disabilities throughout the healthcare system. Sixth, we call for action to be taken to achieve we call for action to be taken to effectively enforce the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The government since 2013 has known of rampant violations. Its enforcement has gone from paltry to abysmal. Seventh, we ask the governments and the opposite parties to each commit to effectively use other levers of power beyond the AODA itself to ensure that Ontario becomes accessible. For example, the government spends billions each year on building new infrastructure projects and on procuring goods and services, but it has no effective, comprehensive, and enforced measures for ensuring that the infrastructure they build and the goods and services they procure are accessible. The most stellar example of that is the new Toronto courthouse on Armory Street, which opened in March of 2023, which is also replete with disability barriers, as a video that we produced amply documents. It was released it was released last August and is available on YouTube for anyone to see. Eighth, voters with disabilities in provincial and municipal elections still face too many accessibility barriers. We call for a pledge to take the needed action so that voters with disabilities can fully participate without disability barriers in municipal and provincial elections. 9, believe it or not, it's bad enough the government hasn't implemented the Disabilities Act effectively enough, but the government itself has actually made things worse, not only by building new capital infrastructure that's got accessibility barriers, but by other measures such as unleashing electric scooters on our streets and sidewalks in a way that endangers vulnerable people with disabilities, seniors, and others, and without any of the needed safeguards to protect us from that danger. Finally, right now, with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act's implementation being so ineffective and so delayed, the only resort people with disabilities have when they face barriers as a practical matter is to file a complaint of discrimination based on disability under the Human Rights Code with the Human Rights Tribunal. That system has degenerated to a state where it is simply dysfunctional. In 2006, the human rights enforcement system was revised on a guarantee that people, or at least on a promise that people with disabilities would get a hearing on the merits on their discrimination complaints within a year of filing their complaint. Well, right now it's more like half a decade, 6 years, even longer. The Human Rights Tribunal itself has spiraled into a state of virtual dysfunctionality. We need a complete review and reform of the human rights process top to bottom. And that's the 10th point in the Accessible Ontario Pledge. Let me conclude with this. Some people think that people with disabilities are just some small little minority group, And, the economy's not in a good shape right now, so it's not the right time. Maybe we can deal with this later. It's never the right time. Over the 30 years of advocacy in this area, we've found that people always come forward with an excuse about why it's not the right time. It is more of the right time now than it has ever been, because we have categorical proof that the government's implementation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act failed to live up to its legislative promise. And that small group that some people think we are, well, we're 2.9 million Ontarians, over 8 million Canadians. Upwards of 1 billion people around the world have disabilities and are potential tourists coming here and customers buying our goods and services, if only they were accessible. The fact of the matter is, everyone either has a disability now, or has someone near and dear to them with a disability, or will get a disability later in their life. It's only natural because aging is the most common cause of disability. So, we are not some small little group. We are the minority of everyone. And in a potential election year, or in any year, no political party, no party leader can afford to ignore the needs of the minority of everyone. We are ready for action. The AODA is not going away, and frankly, neither are we. Thank you very much, and if anyone has any questions, happy to take them.
David, Jeff Gray, Globe and Mail. Might just ask you for, we were talking earlier last year about some of these issues when I talked to the minister about it, and their response is, they have a couple different responses, but one of them is the world has changed. There's so many different so many more disabilities we recognize now. There's new technology, that one set of standards, the sort of model that had been put forward wasn't the right one, wasn't the effective one. I mean, it sounds like an excuse, but what do you make of that response, that idea?
Well, let me tell you a couple of things. First, in the many meetings we've had with governments over the years, absolutely none of them have ever said that to us. So if it's such a compelling argument, why haven't they ever raised it with us? Second, it's nonsense. It's simply nonsense. Yes, technology has evolved, but guess what? Technology makes it easier to accommodate people with disabilities than ever before. 30 years ago, when we started on this voyage, there was no such thing as a smartphone, much less one with a GPS, much less one that talks and can give a blind person like me guidance of exactly where I am and walking directions of where I want to go to. And that's just one little example. So changing in technology is no excuse. And frankly, disability is nothing that's new. We didn't just invent people with disabilities. When this law was enacted and when all parties voted for it, they knew about the barriers we face. That's why they came up with the idea of a 20-year timeline. And so that as well provides no answer. What we have found, Jeff, is that when a government wants to do it, they'll come up with ways to do it. When they don't want to do it, they will invest a lot of creativity into inventing bogus excuses like that one.
What's your, Émilie Pelletier from Le Droit, what's your relationship with this minister, Raymond Cho? Do you find that he's been open to improving accessibility, or?
Well, for one thing, I just want to make it clear that in unveiling this platform, we are eager and open to work with any minister and any government. Early in his mandate, this minister met with us, and we had extensive interaction with the minister's office. This is 2018, 2019. It's now at a point where his office, his political staff don't even answer us. And we haven't had a meeting, a substantive meeting with the minister in years. I did happen to run into him and have a nice little sort of social chat in this building at a reception, but that's about it. This minister was quoted on CBC national radio this morning saying, when I guess he was asked about the lack of effective enforcement, part of his answer was to say, and I'm paraphrasing, you'll need to get the audio, which will be available on CBC's website, but in effect to saying, we don't want to punish people, we think education is the solution. Well, no one's talking about punishing anyone. Monetary penalties are a form of effective enforcement and a form of effective education. People will take legislation seriously if they know there are consequences if they don't comply. I could tell you, as somebody who's taught in university over the years, students want to know if something's on the exam. If it's not on the exam, they don't take it seriously. Well, effective enforcement means it's on the exam. But even worse than that, the minister's answer, as quoted on CBC in his voice this morning, is a categorical abdication of his duty to enforce this law. This idea that, all we need to do is educate people on accessibility. Governments have been doing that. Disability organizations have been doing that, not for years, for decades. And not only has that ship sailed, that ship sunk. The party that took the position that all we needed was to educate people and that'll solve our problems was the Mike Harris conservative government that was elected 30 years ago this June. That was their formal position. They were succeeded by the McGuinty government, who passed the Disabilities Act with effective enforcement built into it. And the Conservative Party, once they were in opposition, voted unanimously for it. And in fact, they went to standing committee hearings in this building in 2005, proposing amendments to make it even stronger. So the position that we all heard on CBC radio from the minister is a very serious retrenchment of the position both that the Conservative Party has taken on this issue, and that the legislation itself mandates for this minister to implement.
Do you have a theory as to why there's not so much enforcement on this as opposed to other, laws and acts in society, thinking of, speed limits? As soon as you go over a speed limit, you get a fine, but if your store isn't accessible, there's not much consequence.
Okay, I can't read their minds. I think that's a great question to ask them. But I will tell you, and let me be clear, it's not just this government that was responsible for ineffective enforcement. Go back to 2013. If you go to our website, aodaalliance.org/enforcement, I'll tell you what you'll find. You'll find that when we tried to get information from the Liberal government, then under Kathleen Wynne, on what they were doing to enforce, we couldn't get any answers. We had to file a Freedom of Information request. Then they tried to insist on us paying thousands of dollars as a search fee until there was an editorial in the Toronto Star and a question period. Then they waived the fee. Then what did we find out? Very, very paltry enforcement, even though there was money available for more enforcement in the budget, even though they had actual knowledge of substantial contraventions of the legislation. We have, over the time since then, been advocating time and again on this issue. And we've never, even back then, and I'm taking you way back in time, in the face of that embarrassment, that government ramped up enforcement somewhat, nowhere near enough, and then a year or two later, kind of was diluting it back down again. So it's been a constant problem. And I want to be clear about this. When we talk about enforcement, we're talking about a responsible, sensible, graduated process of enforcement that the legislation allows for. You inspect an organization. If there's non-compliance, you give them a compliance order. You give them time to comply. If they do, that's it. We're done. If they don't, then monetary penalties can apply. That's a sensible way to deal with it. And we have talked, we've been in contact with people doing, working on or implementing this legislation in a number of different countries, from Israel to New Zealand. And if there's a message we've gotten consistently, it's that where there's effective enforcement, there's a heck of a lot more progress.
Shifting just to the school issue, I know you mentioned there's a lot of issues. I was hoping you just mentioned some specific ones that students are still facing in 2025, just a couple.
Sure, and I'm going to draw on the fact that I'm also every school board has to have a special education advisory committee. I am the chair of the Special Education Advisory Committee for the largest school board in Canada, the Toronto District School Board. And we have pointed out and gone to the trustees to try to get a solution, because parents find it really hard to just find out what services, supports, programs, and placements are available for kids with disabilities at the board and how to access them. I describe the school board as like a restaurant that won't give you a menu, but somehow expects you to order. And that's not unique to the Toronto District School Board. Julia referred to the fact that the government has an expert report it's sat on for 3 years, recommending what the promised education accessibility standard should include. I sat on that committee, that advisory committee, and we identified this problem as one across the board. The problem of being too hard to find out what's even available for your kids. And let me draw on one other point that Julia mentioned. Under the Education Act, every principal has the power to exclude a person from school, to refuse to allow them into school, if they think their presence would be detrimental to the well-being of students there. And this has, in no small numbers, been used on students with disabilities. There's no duty to give reasons to the parents about why they're being told, don't bring your kid to school. There are no time limits. It can go on for days or indeed months. And as well, school boards have the power to tell a student with disabilities, yeah, you can come to school, but not for the full school day. We're giving you a shortened school day. And again, no duty to even give reasons for why they're doing it. So, yeah, the Education Act says everyone has a right to an education, but when it comes to, particularly to kids with disabilities, that stops at the school door, where they could be told unilaterally that they don't have to, or they can't come, either for the whole day or for part of the day. And we have asked, and other advocates, a board member is here in the room, Bruce McIntosh from the Ontario Autism Coalition. We did a news conference right here in 2019, a joint news conference calling for major reforms in this area. And there still haven't been any major reforms in this area. There haven't been any minor reforms. I can tell you that we my coalition wrote every school board in 2020 and asked, what's your policy? I think about half of them didn't even answer, and the others had wildly varying policies, wildly varying. So every principal is a law unto themselves. I don't think they want to be. And what due process you get, if any, varies from one school board to the next around the province. So knowing what's available for you, being able to even go to school, and if you are allowed to go to school for the whole school day, those are just a couple of the barriers. There's tons more we could give you.
And Julia, maybe you could talk about, like, what impact does it have on these kids who are having to get sent home or facing these barriers? Like, what's that like for them?
Essentially, they're not getting an education. They're not being in class with teachers and support staff to help them learn, to guide them through their day, and children are not being given the right to learn. Children with individual education plans that have a clear diagnosed disability are being told that there's not enough support in the schools to keep them in the school safely. And we're seeing with dwindling support staff year after year that children with high support needs are not having their needs met, and it's becoming a safety issue. And then the principal kindly says to the parent, sorry, we can't keep your kid here because there's not enough support. Or maybe the educational assistant is absent for the day, and parent gets a call and says, hey, there's nobody here to support your child. Can you please come pick them up? That's creating a crisis at home for parents. They're not able to work and maintain employment. Their child's not getting an education.
And just to build on that, two things. One, after we're done, one of the people who's here with us and supporting us, Nora Green, Nora, you just identify yourself, is a member of the Special Education Advisory Committee for the Toronto District School Board. Back at the start of November, we held a town hall or a public forum for parents of kids with special education needs at TDSB. And again, I don't want to single TDSB out because these are province-wide problems. But just to give you an example, we invited parents to come in and say, what barriers do your children face at school, and what should be done about it for children with special education needs? And we broke into 3 in-person or virtual settings. Nora chaired one of them. And I have to tell you, the stories we heard were wrenching. Parents were barely holding in the tears in circumstances like what Julia just talked about. And the other thing I want to do is I want to anticipate, if you call the Ministry of Education for a response, why haven't you enacted the education accessibility standard that, you've had this expert report for 3 years now? What's the holdup? I can tell you what they'll say, because they've said it in a standard form response to reporters over and over. They're going to say, we spend more money than anyone on, and we've spent billions on school buildings and so on. And it's missing the point. For one thing, they don't require, they're spending over $1 billion on new schools, but they're not requiring them to be built to be fully accessible. And we documented in the expert report 3 years ago, the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Standards Development Committee report, what should be included in a school building to be accessible. They don't even ask the school boards to try to meet those proposals. Forget meeting all of them, they don't even ask them to try. And as for their claims that we are spending more on whatever, which I'm sure you hear these from governments of all stripes all the time. I'm not singling one government out as doing it more or differently than others. But the fact of the matter is, they haven't set the requirements for the boards to ensure that they make the most effective use of the money that they do give them. This is not all about money. There are areas where additional money would help, but there are lots of things that could be done better within the existing budget. Anything else? All right, thank you all very much. And if you have any further questions, we can always be reached at aodafeedback@gmail.com. Thanks very much and have a good day.